Welcome to the Georgia Public Policy Foundation's Georgia Legends. Hello, I'm Bill Shipp, and joining me today are three of Georgia's political legends: former Governor Ernest Vandiver, former Governor Carl Sanders, and former Lieutenant Governor and Speaker of the Georgia House, George T. Smith. These political contemporaries are here today to discuss the personalities, the events, and the historical context of Georgia in the early 1960s, a pivotal era in our state's history, in which the decisions made by these men and their colleagues shaped the destinies of our state and nation today.
George T., let's start with you. Tell us about what was Georgia like? What was the South like? What was rural Georgia like at the end of the 50s and the beginning of the 60s? An entirely different era of politics.
In one word, they were wild, Bill. I came to the legislature in 1959. Governor Vandiver began his administration in 59. I served through those 4 years and 2 years with Governor Sanders. I want to say up front that those two men are more responsible, I think, for having stable, efficient, and sensible government in this state than the other two men, because they worked at it and they did not play the race issue. And at that time, everything was playing around race. That's why that's what you depend upon to get elected, was race. And it's reversed. The crowd it was used against that time, today is using it the other way. So it was a very emotional time, a very hard time to know what to do, and you simply could not sit down and talk about the issues because it's so emotional.
Ernie, I think when you ran in 1958, some have said that is the last campaign in which a candidate for major office was compelled to play the race card first and foremost. Talk a little about that.
That's right, Bill. I think 90% of the people of Georgia at that time were certainly in favor of segregated schools. I ran on a campaign platform of segregation, county unit system, honesty in government, and restoring power to the legislature. And I had a nephew who said, "Uncle Ernie, 2 out of 4 is not bad." We were able to, with the help of Carl and George and the legislature, to carry Georgia through a very difficult period without disgracing ourselves. Nobody was killed, no big riots were had. I think what we did had some effect probably on South Carolina, Tennessee, North Carolina, and Virginia.
Carl, by the time you ran, 4 years later, you came out as a floor leader in the Vandiver administration. Then you came out in 1962 running. The state had really changed by then. The Baker v. Carr in Tennessee, the one man, one vote thing was out, and as a result, the county unit system failed, and that changed Georgia politics almost overnight, did it not?
Changed it completely. However, when I first went into the governor's race, the Supreme Court had not yet thrown out the county unit system. And I started the campaign under the county unit system. And in the middle of the campaign, the Supreme Court put the county unit system out of existence. And as a result of that, of course, I was the first popular voting governor to be elected on that basis. There had been campaigns in the past, I think back in the days of Jimmy Carmichael and Talmadge. Carmichael, who lived up in Marietta, had gotten the popular vote, but he did not get to be governor because the county unit system prevailed. In my case, fortunately, when the race was over, if they had counted it county unit vote-wise, popular vote-wise, I would have won either way. But the county unit system went out during the middle of our campaign.
Well, I think that's true for both of you. You would have won easily, Ernie, on the popular vote.
Well, I carried 156 of 159 counties and 400 out of 410 unit votes, so I would have won either way. I think it's interesting, though, Bill, that my chief of staff, Griffin Bell, who was appointed judge by President Kennedy, wrote the decision which outlawed the county unit system.
That is interesting. George, see, a lot of people don't know what the county unit system is and how it came to be. It was fashioned allegedly after the Electoral College. Is that not true?
Yeah, that's what it was allegedly fashioned after. It was fashioned after to keep the real people in power. Now, that's what the real move behind it was.
Or conversely, to keep the urban people from controlling, right?
That's right, from controlling. It was way in that right direction. It just wasn't a chance for the urbanites to ever control the legislature and government of the state of Georgia as long as the county unit system stayed in.
Do you think that there was a way at that time to preserve the county unit system by changing the balance of the votes?
I don't know. I really don't know. At that time, you might could have, if the legislature were in mind to, they might could have jerry-rigged it for a few more years, but frankly, I doubt it because everybody's in the mood right then to get on the popular vote and stop weighing the votes. They want one man, one vote. I think.
Well, let me say this: we tried several different plans when the court ruled that the county unit system was not constitutional. Carl was, I think, President Pro Tem of the Senate at that time, and we tried giving the largest cities more units. We tried in many different ways to make it more compatible with what the courts had asked for. But in the end, they threw it all out.
Did you feel, Carl, that you were going to be running a popular vote campaign before the...
Not when I entered the race, but, you know, the effort to throw out the county unit system had gone on for many, many years, and the Supreme Court always took the position that they, to quote them, that they were not going to be drawn into that political thicket, and they stayed out of it for years and years and years, so there was no real reason for me to believe, or anybody else to believe, that they were going to change that decision that they had been up there 3 or 4 times. And they, of course, finally threw it out. And no question about it, I don't think there's any way that anybody could have resurrected the county unit system, because I think they'd made up their mind there was going to be a one-person, one-vote method of electing public officials, and from that point on, that's the way it's been.
Something phenomenal happened in the middle of this era in 1960. John F. Kennedy, considered by many to be a liberal Democrat, also a Roman Catholic, came to Georgia one time and yet took the state, I believe, by a greater margin than any other state except Rhode Island, even a greater margin when he took his home state of Massachusetts. And you were telling me, Ernie, before you went on the air, something very interesting about the beginnings of that campaign.
Senator Russell and Senator Talmadge at that time and I all got together. They were very close to Lyndon Johnson, and they thought that Lyndon Johnson would more closely follow our philosophy than any other. And we all decided that Kennedy would be the best candidate because Johnson was the vice presidential candidate. I went to Washington and met with then Senator Kennedy and then Senator Johnson. In Senator Johnson's special room, he was majority leader. Went with Bob Russell, who was the national committeeman, James Gray, who was the head of the Democratic Party, and we met with Johnson, with Kennedy, and I believe there was one other senator who was present. But anyway, I asked to speak with Senator Kennedy alone, and I asked him, I told him that we wanted to support it, but I had one caveat that I wanted to discuss with him, and that was that no troops would ever be sent into the state of Georgia, as had happened already in Arkansas. And I thought it was a disgraceful situation.
And later happened in Mississippi.
It happened in Mississippi, too. And he agreed that he would not send troops into Georgia. And I told him that we would handle our own situation as best we could.
That's the first time I've heard that story. I think that is a real footnote to history. And you remember that possibility, Carl, as Kennedy moved through, he became disenchanted with Johnson, and there was talk that he might turn to another Southerner, even perhaps you as a running mate had he survived.
Well, I heard all that, but of course everybody has the opportunity to have, 15 minutes of fame in their life? And when we went to the Democratic Convention in Atlantic City, Alabama, George Wallace stayed home. He didn't go up there with the delegation from Alabama. And so the Alabama delegation got up and nominated me for vice president at the convention. And of course, I immediately got up and asked him to withdraw my name because I knew, as well as everybody else at this table knows, that political conventions are pretty well set and cut and dried. But all that hoopla that you get there, you don't get many of these floor nominations that amount to anything. And Hubert Humphrey, of course, was to be Lyndon Johnson's running mate, and everybody knew it. But prior to that time, back in the Kennedy thing, there was some rumblings that he was disenchanted with Johnson. But politics being what it is, Jack Kennedy needed Lyndon Johnson for his base in Texas and some electoral votes that he controlled. And I don't think there'd been any question, but had Kennedy survived, that Johnson would continue to have been the nominee on the ticket.
Let me tell you what happened at the convention prior to that one when Kennedy was nominated. After he was nominated, he called all the governors of the various states together. And we met in a hotel room. And he went around the room and asked each governor who he would recommend to be his vice presidential nominee. And we had Menon Williams, who raised a lot of keen about the possibility of Johnson being the nominee. Practically every southern state was in favor of Johnson because we felt like he was one of ours. And at the end of the meeting, we did not know what Kennedy was going to do. We went back to the convention, and Fritz Hollins and some of the other governors asked me if I would run for vice president. And of course, I had had a heart attack about 6 months before, and I wasn't even thinking about it. But when Johnson was named as the vice presidential nominee, all of the South moved to Johnson because they felt like he was one of ours, so to speak.
People still look back at that era and wonder how in the world did Georgia, deep South, wool hat state, go for this guy, Jack Kennedy, out of Massachusetts.
He was a conservative, much more conservative than people ever realized. And as much as you think about Kennedy being a liberal, when you sat down and talked with him and dealt with him, his political philosophy was much more conservative than the public realized.
But he didn't just take the state, he swept the state. Was that because the Democratic organization then was so tightly knit? In fact, once again, as your chief of staff, Griffin Bell, who was the co-chair of that campaign.
He and George L. Smith.
He and George L. Smith were co-chairmen. We had a meeting about a week, 10 days prior to that election. We had Governor Luther Hodges of North Carolina. We had Fritz Hollins of South Carolina. We had Buford Ellington of Tennessee. We had the governor of Alabama, who I forget at this time who he was. But we had all of the southern states. We had the governor of Florida. And we met in Atlanta at the old Dinkler Hotel. And had
Jim Folsom, was it?
Folsom was,
yeah.
Right.
Anyway, we had a wonderful meeting, if you remember, Carl. And I think that meeting had a lot to do with the South going for Kennedy.
Well, the South was still Democratic at heart at that time. It never had any inroads into it, and people just naturally thought if he's a Democrat, even though they might not like him from the outside, if the local leadership, and the leadership of state captain had a tremendous influence throughout the state, more so than they do now. And they would listen
there were
to
certain people who were really opposed to him, like Roy Harris, who was one of your political enemies. He did everything in his power to defeat Kennedy in Georgia, but as you say, Kennedy swept the state.
Well, another reason that I think Kennedy swept the state of Georgia was that was the very beginning of the era of television. And he was the most charismatic individual on television that this country had ever seen at that point. And there were many, many young people who I don't know whether they thought they were totally Democratic or Republican, but who were drawn to Jack Kennedy because of the image that he presented on television. He was very articulate, a very nice-looking fellow, and television at that point turned out to be, and later as we know it today, to become the most powerful medium in the political world.
Let me tell you what happened. We met Kennedy in Columbus when he spoke at Warm Springs. Herman Talmadge and I did, and brought him from Columbus to Warm Springs. And I have never seen such enthusiasm of the people as we rode along from Columbus to Warm Springs, and particularly among the ladies. They screamed almost like they used to when Frank Sinatra was singing. So he was very attractive not only to the men but to the ladies too.
Let's talk just a second about the media. You, Ernie, ran somewhat of a TV campaign, but Carl, you had the first big television campaign, and I think that you would agree it helped get you elected.
Well, I agree.
But has, over the long haul, do you think that's helped politics, hurt it? What do you think the long-term effect of the change in the media has been?
I think it's helped politics, if everything being considered. I think the television media has allowed more people to see candidates and to listen to them and to make up their minds about them than the era when I was campaigning and when Ernie was campaigning, and for that matter, George T., when you went to the courthouse and people went to the courthouse or they went out to the barbecue, and that was a wonderful period of time, but that was mostly entertainment. People went there to listen to the candidates because they didn't have anything else to do to entertain them.
But isn't that what a television campaign is now?
Well, I think it is in many respects, but on the other hand, it is it's the closest thing to being just like you and I sitting across this table, sitting in your living room, and at least listening to somebody without necessarily having to listen to everything you necessarily want to hear, but you can cut them off, or you can turn them on, but you can listen to a variety of them. Television is powerful. It will always be powerful. It can be misused. There are a lot of people today that package candidates up, you know, like they sell soap up on Madison Avenue. But on the other side of it, I think it's still the best way for the average citizen to get to know the people who are running for public office.
But don't you think Ernie has changed the character, the kind of people who offer for public office?
I think so. I did have 30 minutes each week that I spent on television for about 10 weeks during the campaign. And I was advised by my PR man to speak as though I was speaking to somebody in the room. Now, Marvin Griffin, when he was on television, he had his speeches televised by the camera and used the tape for his campaign, and he was screaming into that microphone like he was talking to the campaign crowd. And you don't do that when you talk one-to-one with the people of the state in your campaign.
It's a cool medium. You're supposed to be very understated when you speak to them. You don't rant and rave. If you do, that was one of the problems of Lyndon Johnson. When he spoke on television, he was like an evangelistic preacher, and he turned more people off than he turned on. When he sat in a room like we're sitting here and sat across the table and talked to you, he could be one of the most persuasive individuals you've ever talked to. It was completely a different situation, but you put him on TV, and he was terrible.
His whole personality changed.
Jack Kennedy was good on television.
He was not very charismatic either. Lyndon was.
Oh, that's true. Something else changed during this era, and I think it was the character of the legislature. In fact, in your campaign, that was an issue, the independence of the state legislature. George T. Smith became Carl Sanders Speaker of the House by one vote. Is that right?
The governors.
Tell us a little bit about the character of the legislature at that time.
Well, when I came to the legislature in '59, of course, I knew absolutely nothing about it. And I Frank Twitty, Mitchell County. I was born and raised in Mitchell County. I was from Grady County. So Frank trained me in the ways of the legislature. They said, the governor runs the legislature, and the governor's going to select a speaker, and the governor's going to select a floor leader, and George L. and I have been selected. And I like you, and we'd like for you to join our team. But I was smart enough to take the suggestion. And the governor selected the speaker back then. He decided who he wanted to have. I want to tell you something. They ain't in a bad way. It's not a bad way. That keeps the governor and the speaker from beating each other to death all the way through, and they work together. And whenever I ran for speaker, I didn't run for speaker. Carl asked me, would I be his speaker? I didn't run for it. I said, you're mighty right, I will, friend, when you want me to start. So Governor Sanders selected me and got me elected as speaker. I'm proud of it. Otherwise, I'd have never made it.
Was it true there was a hotline from the governor's office to the speaker's phone?
Absolutely.
Always.
Always. Well,
George,
why not?
George T. and I had gone to law school together. George L. Smith was a speaker from Swainsboro, and he was a good man. He was Ernest speaker, and he was a very good politician. But George L. didn't support me when I ran. In fact, when I went to Swainsboro, I never saw him because he never showed up at any of the rallies.
Didn't want to be seen.
He didn't want to be seen. So when I got elected, he had a reporter in his office one day, and he said to the reporter, no governor is strong enough to depose me as speaker. That was his comment. That's when I called George T. and said, George T., you're going to be the Speaker of the House. He said, how am I going to get elected? I said, I'm going to elect you. And within 24 hours, we had gotten enough votes to elect George T.
126 to be exact.
That's right. And that just shows back in those days how much power the governor of the state had. And I'm sure the same thing applied with Ernie, with George L. I mean, if he'd wanted to name somebody else Speaker, he could have named somebody else Speaker. I named George T. He was a great speaker. We did have a straight line to the speaker's desk, and I had to use it a few times. One time to explain to him to get Denmark Groove off the floor and quit letting him continue to make speeches when we already had the bill passed.
Well, then he went upstairs and like to fall over the balcony and down the clock now. Well, let me tell you, I got to tell you one more thing about this speaker thing. I asked Charlie Parnell later, I said, Charlie, how did I get to be selected to be the speaker by Carl? He said, you was the best thing we had. I said, I don't care, I got selected. That Lord, I got selected.
No, I'll tell you how he got to be selected. I knew that when I said something to George T. and he said something to me, that I could count on it, and I didn't have to go home at night and sit there and toss and turn and worry about whether or not what he and I had agreed on was going to be different the next morning. And in politics, in my book, a politician's word is his bond. And there are a lot of people who believe that, but unfortunately, there are some that don't. And if you don't have people in your administration that you can absolutely count on, whatever the chips might be and whatever the issue might be, you've got a problem. That's why George T. was selected as Speaker, because I had enough confidence in his character and in his ability that I knew that whatever we did, it would be that way from now on.
But then the governor's program was virtually assured, except for minor details of passing the House. I remember your program of vast reform in mental health in Milledgeville sailed through the House almost without any debate.
That and the honesty in government bills that we had passed that are still, I think, today have an effect on our state government.
Honesty bill was House Bill number 1, wasn't it?
That's House Bill number 1.
Well, the program back in our era was nothing moved in the legislature until the governor's program was passed.
That's correct.
Nobody else ever got a bill up for a vote until all of the legislation that I had proposed or Ernie had proposed had been first brought up and voted on. And that's the way it operated.
So you can see who was going to support your bills in return for any help that they
Absolutely.
might need.
And the state of
Absolutely.
Let me tell you, the most important time in a governor's administration is before he takes office, because he picks the people who will head the various departments in state government, and the tone is set before he ever is inaugurated. And I felt like that was the most important time of my administration.
the State of Republic Committee handled all the governor's legislation, and I was, Frank Twitty got me on the State of Republic Committee, so I was right there next to where the heart beat.
Well, now, you served as lieutenant governors, and you almost ran for lieutenant governor, but the fact of the matter was the state senate was, at that period, was impotent. Is that not?
It was different because it was on a rotation basis. The counties would rotate the senators. No senators stayed there long enough to really gain a lot of power.
And the lieutenant governor was a relatively, well, he was also a new officer, but a relatively, not a minor figure, but he was a figure sort of in waiting. Is that not true?
As I used to say, that when I was lieutenant governor, I got up and looked at the headlines. If the governor was all right, I went back to bed.
Well, you're right. I almost did run for lieutenant governor, but one of the reasons I didn't, among others, was because I knew what the job consisted of, and it's just what he said. It was pretty much of an errand boy's job at that era. It later, I think, has assumed much more responsibility. And the reason that I didn't run was because some of my political opponents, who were also trying to run for lieutenant governor, put a fellow in the lieutenant governor's race that was named Carl F. Sanders, a lawyer in Atlanta that I'd never heard of. And I knew at that point that I was going to have some difficulty when somebody went in the polls and tried to vote for Carl E. Sanders or Carl F. Sanders. That was one of the reasons that I moved on up into the governor's race.
You were the big E.
That's right.
You went to the County Commissioners Association convention.
Had a big E on my coat and all to try to go around and distinguish myself, E from F, if you can believe that, and that's the way it was going. And of course, I accused some of the people who were running, Peter Zach was Ernie's executive secretary when I was his floor leader, and both of us wanted to be lieutenant governor at that time because Marvin Griffin was going to run and Garland Byrd was a lieutenant governor and he was going to run. So we were both trying to get to be lieutenant governor, and it got to be a pretty hot campaign of trying to get there, and that sort of moved me into the other race. And once I decided that I was going to run for governor, I kept getting all these phone calls from people that really had not been supporting me, saying, "You made a big mistake. We've got the county locked up for you for lieutenant governor, and now you've decided to run for governor, and you can't carry the county for governor." And I said, well, it's too late now. I'm in the governor's race.
Walking out of the history books and into the lives of those who made history, Georgia Legends brings to life the persons and events who helped shape our great state. We wish to thank former Governor Ernest Vandiver, former Governor Carl Sanders, and former Lieutenant Governor and Speaker of the Georgia House, George T. Smith, for being here today. From those who led our state through tough and challenging times to those who desire to know more about our state's rich and colorful history, we thank you for joining us.